Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's ContainerJournal.com program, brought to you by Techstrong and Fairwinds. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning, and we have an exciting panel ahead. First, I just need to cover a couple of housekeeping notes. So today's session is being recorded. So if you miss any of our discussion, or maybe you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session today. If you have any questions, we'd like you to send those in to us using the Q&A tab, which can be found on the right side of the screen. This is more of a discussion and conversation-based program that we have today, so we want to mix your questions in throughout, so please do send them in as soon as you think of them. We also have 2 polls throughout today's program that we'd really like your participation in. And of course, before we close out, we are giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So be sure to stick around for the duration of today's program. So our topic is Kubernetes cost control strategies for 2023. And I'm joined by Robert Brennan, Vice President of Product Development at Fairwinds, Liz Kuhlman, Product Manager at Fairwinds, and leading our conversation today will be Grace Goody, Engineering Manager at Fairwinds. So Robert, Liz, Grace, thank you all so much for joining me. Grace, I'll give you the floor from here.
Thank you so much for having us, Cody. Like Cody said, this is Kubernetes cost controls for 2023. We're going to be talking about Kubernetes primarily through a FinOps lens. And we hope to share some allocation and optimization strategies that could expand your visibility into costs by enabling you to compare spend against a budget. But first, let's start with some introductions. Liz, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Hi there. My name is Liz Kuhlman. I am one of the newer members of the Fairwinds team, and I am a product manager.
Thanks, Liz. And what about you, Robert?
Hey, I'm Robert Brennan, VP of Product Development here at Fairwinds. I've been helping to develop a bunch of cost as well as security-related software here at Fairwinds.
Thanks, y'all. And I am Grace Goody. I'm an engineering manager at Fairwinds, where I support the development team that builds Insights, which I think we'll be giving a demo of later today. So let's just jump right in. I wanted to start off just by reading our mission statement. Fairwinds is the trusted partner for Kubernetes security, policy, and governance. At Fairwinds, we really hope to help our customers ship cloud native applications faster. We hope to make sure everyone's spending the right amount of money and that there's a low amount of risk. All right, so to get started, I wanted to also mention that today at Fairwinds, we're heavily focused on software, and our software is focused on helping people do Kubernetes right. We have several open source projects that we invite you to check out, such as Goldilocks, which can help you make your resource requests and limits just right. We've built a lot of logic into our software around FinOps and managing costs, and that's why we're here to talk to y'all today. But first, let's start off with a polling question. We just want to know, where are you in your Kubernetes journey? Are you just starting to learn about containers in Kubernetes? Are you planning to use it in the next 6 to 12 months? Are you using it in a testing or development environment, or are you already using it in production? Lately, we've been seeing more and more people using Kubernetes in production. When we first kind of started out, it was mostly that we were talking to people just starting to learn about containers and Kubernetes. But yeah, more and more people are really starting to use Kubernetes in production, and we would love to help support those people. So yeah, just let us know where you are in your journey. Awesome. Yeah, this looks about right. Lots of people just starting to learn, lots of people already using it in production, and a few people somewhere in between. So this is a great place for you guys to be, and we're excited to support you on your journey. Awesome. So I think we're just going to get right into it. And the first question I wanted to ask is, why is Kubernetes cost estimation so difficult? Robert, do you want to start us off on that?
Yeah, so, in the days before Kubernetes, typically what you would do if you wanted to launch a new application is you would provision, say, a new EC2 instance in Amazon, maybe multiple EC2 instances for that application. And what was nice about that is that you would get your AWS bill and it would say, you use 3 AWS instances for this application, and you would know exactly how much that application costs to map directly to your bill. With Kubernetes, though, you basically give the Kubernetes cluster a bunch of EC2 instances, and then those EC2 instances get shared among a bunch of different applications. So now there's no real like mapping between your AWS bill and individual applications. All those applications are sharing the same instances that AWS is billing you for. So you really need to be able to look inside the Kubernetes cluster to understand how those resources got divided up among all your applications, so that you can know which applications are costing you the most, which ones might be spending more than their allocated budget, et cetera.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You kind of want to find a way to make sure all the different teams have that information. And anything to add to that, Liz?
No, I think that about covers it.
I agree. And why is it important that everyone has visibility into costs? Liz, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so that I have lots of thoughts on, and I think it mostly depends on where you fall in your organization and what your goals are. So to start at a super high framework nerdy level, especially for those that are exploring Kubernetes, I would say that most organizational frameworks, if you're trying to implement change, transparency is really how you get that organizational buy-in, and FinOps is no exception to that. So not only does it increase your odds of success through buy-in and education, it also increases that level of accountability, because even if the finance department is the face of those expenses, right? Generally, the people contributing to those expenses occur at all levels. So that's kind of the high level answer. And then at the implementation level, you really want to empower those service teams to take ownership, just from an efficiency standpoint, rather than waiting on this feedback loop of executives find something a bit scary. It gets back to those teams. They have to make those changes. If you're putting it into their hands directly, not only are they seeing the value of the positive organizational habits you're trying to implement and the why behind them, but you're also shortening that feedback loop, and they're able to catch and prevent those risks early before an action on those immediately before they become a wider issue as well.
Totally. That makes a lot of sense. Robert, anything to add there?
No, I would just say, from the perspective of a developer, somebody who's worked as a developer, it's usually just kind of a black box. Like I kind of merge my source code and I don't really think about costs. So having that visibility available to me and kind of pushed in my direction is super helpful, so that I can understand how a change I made might impact memory usage, which might end up impacting our bottom line.
Totally important to have that showback and chargeback happening.
Yeah.
Liz, you mentioned creating a feedback loop to improve costs. Can you say more about that?
Sure. So I think it's really important to give teams the tools they need to action. I think it's really important to have a tool that will scan for issues and create action items. Nudge, we have a tool that does just that. But also something that allows you to assign those out from whatever part of the org that you are in and monitoring these action items. In the tools that the developers use, again, increasing that efficiency. So for example, being able to assign it out via a third party is just another strategy that you can use to shorten that communication delay that could occur in what might be a really large organization where the action teams are spread out pretty far from each other.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Like a lot of times when this goes poorly, the whole burden of setting resource settings like CPU and memory settings falls on the SRE team. And oftentimes it's, a few engineers responsible for this across, dozens of applications, dozens of engineering teams. And a lot of times those SREs don't have the context necessary to understand exactly how much memory and CPU these applications should be using. So it's important to, as much as possible, shift that responsibility leftward onto the actual development teams who are building these applications, who do have that context and have the bandwidth to do this, rather than putting all that pressure on a few SREs.
And I will say, fun fact, one of the biggest struggles from people surveyed in the FinOps organization is getting developers to take action, not because they don't want to, but because they maybe don't feel necessarily empowered to. So just to, this pain is felt, I think, pretty commonly.
Totally. That makes a lot of sense. Thanks, y'all. So we've talked a little bit about why Kubernetes cost estimation is so difficult and how important it is that people do have visibility into costs. So how do we know how much we are spending? What are some tips that we can provide to kind of get a deeper view on how much someone is spending? Robert?
So I think the big thing is to have something inside your Kubernetes cluster monitoring how much CPU and memory you're using. That might be something generic like Datadog, which can grab basically raw data on CPU and memory, and then you can work within the Datadog UI to kind of aggregate that in ways that make sense for you. There are also some pre-built tools, some open source, some commercial tooling. For instance, we have an open source project called Goldilocks that helps to understand, how much memory and CPU you've requested versus how much you're actually using, and how to maybe set those requests more appropriately. We also have commercial software called Fairwinds Insights, which does a lot of this heavy lifting for you. It shows you both your historical usage as well as suggesting what you might want to set your resource requests and limits to. So I would say at the very least have something like Datadog in there gathering these stats so that you can look at it historically if you need to. But even better is to use some specialized tooling that's focused on cost rather than just raw metrics in order to get a really good grasp on what the dollar amount is that you can charge back to a team.
Totally. Yeah, Goldilocks is a great tool. That's one of our open source projects, and we'd love to have more contributors. So check Goldilocks out on GitHub when y'all have a second. What about tagging? Would you recommend that people use labels or annotations to help check in on costs?
Yeah, I think the first pass should be using namespaces, just giving each team their own namespace or each application its own namespace. That's a great way to just start to partition things out. Labels kind of give you a more versatile way of doing it too. You can label things as production versus staging, as user facing versus not. You can kind of label things however you want. Labels are a great way to kind of slice and dice things along different dimensions, right? You might want to see all your production apps versus all your staging apps. You might want to see everything that belongs to team X versus team Y. And labels are a great way to do that. Annotations are not quite appropriate for this particular use case. Typically, annotations get used to contain some like structured data that will like modify application behavior in some ways. So I would avoid using annotations and really stick to labels.
Awesome. That's good. Good to know. Is there such a thing as under provisioning?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Typically, if you're under provisioned, you'll find out pretty quickly. Like your application will be really slow because you don't have enough CPU available, or you'll get out of memory exceptions because you don't have enough memory available. So it's not something we see super often, just because people tend to notice it and fix it very quickly. But it is something that definitely happens. A more common case is folks over provision, which doesn't lead to any noticeable performance issues. The application is not crashing or anything. It's just leading to overspend on your cloud bill. So folks, that's a problem that tends to go unnoticed for a longer period of time.
That makes sense. So I would think that it would be good to know, how much. Like we talked a little bit about knowing like how much each application costs or how much each client costs. Is there a way to track that in Kubernetes?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. If you've got a single tenant type architecture where maybe every individual customer has their own namespace or has their own containers that are running, and they're totally separate from each other, then it's pretty easy to understand how much each customer costs, right? In the same way you might understand how much each application costs. You can kind of look at those. You can look at those containers. You can split them up based on the customer, based on namespace, things like that. If you've got more of a multi-tenant application, it gets a little harder. because it's hard to understand exactly how much of the CPU and memory inside of one container should be allocated to different clients. So in that case, you might have a way, say, using Datadog or some other log aggregator to say, okay, I see this many requests per minute from this client. They're sending me this many bytes of data. They're creating this many widgets inside of the application. However you want to break down your unit costs, you can start to split that up by customer. Maybe that's doing some partitioning in your database. Maybe it's doing partitioning in the logs based on request data that's coming in. In a multi-tenant application, it's a little trickier. You kind of have to understand your application. It requires a lot more application context.
That makes a lot of sense. So going back to CPUs and that sort of thing, how do you know what to set your CPUs to?
Yeah, really, really good question. So we mentioned this this project Goldilocks earlier. Goldilocks will actually look at your historical CPU usage and compare that to what your requests and limits are set to. So if it sees, your usage is trying to spike above what your requests and limits are very frequently, it's going to recommend you increase those requests and limits. If it sees that it's consistently lower than those requests and limits, it's going to recommend you that you shrink them, right? The reason we call it Goldilocks is it helps you get your requests and limits just right. Same for memory settings as well. Goldilocks is a little bit limited in the amount of history it can collect and things like that. It doesn't really keep any permanent state. So we also have a commercial application, which we'll show you all later, called Fairwinds Insights, which does show the historical data as well as your current settings and recommended settings, so that you can better decide what those requests and limits should be set to. But regardless of what you're using, it's really a matter of comparing your historical usage to what your settings are and deciding if your settings are appropriate.
I have kind of a question, if I could jump in. What do you recommend for people who are, it sounds like this is a little bit of a trial and error process as you're just starting out. For those who are like kind of net new, square one, what would your advice be for safeguarding, way under provisioning, or, just making sure that our starting point is conservative or safe?
Yeah, I think typically what I would do is just start, like you said, very conservatively. Start with like over provisioning, like necessarily over provision. Don't go too crazy, but pick enough memory and CPU that your application is going to behave properly, and then monitor it for a week or two. You want to be able to see how your application behaves in several different kinds of environments, right? You want to know, not just how it behaves for the first hour that it gets deployed, but how does it behave at night versus daytime, weekends versus weekdays? A lot of applications have some cyclical behavior. They see a big burst in traffic every morning or during the day, and then it tends to sleep at nighttime, or it's very busy on the weekends versus weekdays, or vice versa. So I think gathering a week or two of data to see what your application looks like under different types of load, and then going back and looking at, okay, what did the usage actually look like relative to what my settings were, and how should I adjust those settings going forward? And typically you'll want to, again, start very high and kind of tamp it down over time.
Nice. Thanks for that question, Liz. That was great. We actually have a question from the audience. How do these costs map to the cost data provided by a public cloud provider, such as AWS or Azure, if your application is running on those platforms?
Yeah, great question. So the cloud provider is typically going to give you cost data that is related to specific, basically it'll give you a line item for every virtual machine that you spin up on their system, right? So that might be EC2 instances in Amazon, for instance. And the difficult thing about that is that you're going to associate, say 10, 20, 100 EC2 instances with your Kubernetes cluster. And so you'll be able to easily see on your AWS bill, okay, this Kubernetes cluster cost me $1,000 this month. But within that Kubernetes cluster, you have, 15 different applications running. And if you can't see from the AWS bill how much each of the individual applications cost. Did this application take up 90% of the space in that Kubernetes cluster? Or, was it only 1%? Or, was the Kubernetes cluster totally over provisioned? Maybe I'm only using 10% of the resources inside of that cluster. And so you really need, on top of that AWS bill, you really need something running inside the cluster, letting you introspect, all the different applications that are running in there to understand, how does that, how do those 100 instances that got provisioned to your Kubernetes cluster, what's the breakdown between different applications?
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Robert. And thank you, participant 319, for the great question. So once you figure out how much you're spending, how do you find waste? How do you find the places where you could save money?
Yeah, I think the first place to look is just kind of at like a cluster level. Understand where how well provisioned each of your nodes are. Like you can see, you've got, say, 100 CPUs across all your nodes, but you're only using 4 CPUs total. That's an immediate indication. Okay, you've got a bigger cluster than you need for. Maybe you need fewer nodes, maybe you need differently sized nodes, things like that. That's kind of the first place to look. And then I would look at individual workloads and see, okay, how much CPU and memory are these workloads requesting? How much are they actually using? Do we have too many replicas running for each individual workload? Like, can we scale down our replicas a little bit without impacting users? So kind of starting from that bird's eye view, understanding where your biggest costs are, and then zooming in, as you chip away at that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Robert. Could you tell us a little bit about idle costs and how you might recommend allocating those?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think it's pretty dependent on each organization. There's some organizations will just kind of treat that as like, dead weight. They'll kind of just acknowledge like, okay, my idle costs, maybe they'll build them to the SRE team and say, okay, yes, it's on the SREs to figure out, if we can cut down on these idle costs a little bit. Other organizations will split up those idle costs between all the different teams that are, within their organization. It kind of depends on how you want to do building within your org. A certain level of idle costs are kind of necessary. Like you're never going to get 100% capacity. You don't really want 100% capacity. You want some extra capacity sitting there for you to burst up into, in case you get like a burst of new traffic or something like that. So it does make sense to have a little extra idle cost sitting there. But in terms of like who to charge for that idle cost, I think it's kind of up to your organization.
That makes sense. So I know you mentioned earlier it can be difficult to get accurate reporting on how the costs of multi-tenant clusters are being allocated, but do you have any advice on how that might be discovered?
Yeah, I think breaking down, just trying to find basically what are the things that you can measure that correlate with how much a user costs or how much a customer costs you, right? If you're Twitter, you might want to understand like your cost per tweet. If you're Instagram, it might be cost per post. It might be cost per hour of usage.
So a tweet is kind of considered a unit of cost in that.
Exactly. Yeah.
That makes sense.
It definitely depends on the business, like what your, what your costs scale with. I know here at Fairwinds, we break down our unit costs mainly by the number of requests that we're getting from each of our customers, as well as the size of those requests. Our costs tend to scale along with those two metrics. And so those are the two metrics we are able to easily measure using our logging. And they scale pretty well with the cost that we incur with each customer. So it's fairly easy for us to measure those things and correlate them with the customers.
Awesome.
And I will say from a product perspective, one of the things that we've been hearing a lot is this need for a bird's eye view to even compare customers with each other, just at a high level. So one of the things we've been super focused on as well is providing this ability to aggregate so that you can have more of a comparable, this team or this customer against each other, kind of how do we fall historically as well in our showback feature.
Awesome. Thanks for mentioning that, Liz.
Yeah.
So what other just best practices or any other tools that either of you would recommend people be thinking about as they're thinking about costs?
Yeah, I think at a high level, some other things that are helpful for managing costs. One would be just looking at auto scaling, both for individual applications using something like the horizontal pod autoscaler. You can configure that to basically scale the number of replicas for your application up and down based on things like how much traffic you're getting, the size of a work queue, the amount of CPU utilization within each replica, things like that. So that's super helpful rather than having each of your teams just set, okay, I want 5 replicas and that being a fixed number of replicas. Like I was saying before, you might have kind of a cyclical application where you get a bunch of traffic during the day and you want to have 8 replicas then, but at night it's very low traffic and you want to go down to 2 replicas. Doing that kind of automatic scaling is something Kubernetes is really, really good at. It takes some time to set up and configure, but it's definitely highly, highly recommended. In addition, you probably want to investigate auto scaling for the cluster as a whole. So the number of nodes that you have based on how much memory and CPU all these different applications are requesting. So if you've got maybe several applications that are scaling up during the day and down at night, you probably want more nodes during the day and fewer nodes at night. And that's going to really affect your costs. Again, if you don't have auto scaling, you're kind of always going to need to be scaled all the way up. At the most level you might actually use. And so that cluster autoscaler can really help to save money and cut away nodes at night that you don't actually need to use. In addition to the auto scaling, I think another big one is spot instances, especially for clusters that are maybe non-production. So like development staging clusters can really benefit from using spot instances. These are instances that are basically provisioned in like kind of a just-in-time way from your cloud provider, where the cloud provider kind of can pick which instance type to give you and which instance class to use based on where they have surplus. So it's cheaper for them, and they basically pass on some of that savings to you. The downside being that they might remove nodes at any given time. They might pull them back. So if you don't have it configured properly, it may cause some minor disruptions to service. If you have it configured properly, though, you can use it in production. We see companies use it in production, and it does create substantial savings. So highly recommend using Spot for non-production stuff, and if you have the time to configure it properly for production stuff.
Awesome, good to know.
Sorry.
Please go ahead, Liz.
Oh no, this came up recently during a client conversation, but one thing that I was wondering about your opinion on, Robert, was scoping out like your stale workloads and how that might impact costs as well, and if you had any best practice advice there as well.
Great question.
No, that's a great question. A lot of times at bigger organizations, we'll see, if you kind of give developers the keys to the kingdom and let them deploy test applications and things like that, they might deploy applications and then just like forget about them. They might deploy a demo that they can share with their colleagues and then they forget about it. And that thing's sitting in there using 1 CPU and 1 gig of memory, and it's just taking up space. And you might have 100 of those over time. So it's important to have some kind of monitoring in there to look for those stale deployments. There are different ways to measure it. You can measure it based on network traffic, like is no network traffic coming into this thing, then it's probably not getting used. You can look at, okay, this thing hasn't been updated in 3 months, so probably nobody's deploying it, nobody's maintaining it. We can probably delete it. You may want to automatically delete those things if they're in a staging environment. That might be a little scary, though. You might just want to have alerts and just bug your developers. Hey, this thing hasn't been touched. Do we really need it? So it kind of depends on the organization how aggressive you want to be about deleting these things. You obviously don't want to take down production just because you've been away on break for 2 weeks. It's definitely something to keep an eye on, those stale workloads.
Thanks for bringing that up. That was a great question. Any other tools that you would recommend people be looking at? I know Prometheus is a popular one at Fairwinds. Any other tools that you all like to use that you'd recommend others check out?
Yeah, so Goldilocks, like we mentioned before, is an open source project from us. That's a great way to get started, just figuring out what to set your CPU and memory requests and limits to. Prometheus is a great one for just gathering raw data. How much CPU and memory are you using? How much disk and network, things like that. I think there are some other open source tooling out there, some commercial tooling like Fairwinds Insights, which we'll show you. I'm trying to think. There's another.
I've heard of a tool, Kada, I believe is what it's called for. Is that for auto scaling?
Yeah. Kada does some really awesome stuff with auto scaling. You can set I was talking about before, maybe you have a very cyclical environment where you want to scale down at night and scale up during the day. Maybe you have developer environments that you just want to scale down to 0 replicas after 8 p.m. Eastern time, and then scale back up in the morning. Kada can do some really awesome things around using schedules and stuff like that to auto scale. So much more fine-grained and a lot more options for auto scaling using some of those third-party scaling tools.
Very cool. Well, on the note of tools, I think we might be about ready for a demo, if you're open to that, Robert.
Yeah, let me share my screen here.
Awesome. And please, if anyone in the audience continues to have questions regarding insights or anything we've talked about today, anything regarding costs, just continue to throw them in the chat.
Cool. So this is Fairwinds Insights. Hopefully you all are seeing a list of clusters right now. Yell at me if you're not.
Looks great.
So Fairwinds Insights, basically, it runs inside your Kubernetes environments and gathers a bunch of data about how healthy those clusters are. So it looks at things from a security perspective, an efficiency perspective, and a reliability perspective. So here we have a demo account with about a dozen clusters reporting in. You can see, how the health score of each of these clusters. We've got an A rating here, which is nice, but there are some issues you can see within these clusters that we should probably fix. In terms of the types of things that we check, Fairwinds Insights basically serves as a hub for a bunch of different open source tools that the community has developed for detecting best practices, security issues, things like that. Some of those projects are created by us here at Fairwinds. Some of them are created by the cloud native open source community. We really try to lean on the community as much as possible for those best in class standards that are out there. Some examples are Polaris, which is a project that we manage that looks for best practices whether you're setting CPU and memory requests and limits, whether you've set liveness and readiness probes, whether you're running containers as root or not, whether your file system is read only. So a lot of security things, reliability things, efficiency things that Polaris can just check for in all of your configuration. Trivy is one that's built by the open source community. It scans all your containers for known vulnerabilities. Super important for things like you all may have heard of the Log4j vulnerability that was announced several months ago. Super critical vulnerability. Trivy was able to detect Log4j in any containers running inside your Kubernetes cluster so that you immediately have eyes on whether or not you're vulnerable to Log4j. Another one here is Open Policy Agent, otherwise known as OPA, that lets you write custom policies. Maybe you have an internal labeling scheme. We talked about using labels before to help break down costs. Maybe you want to put a cost center code label on all of your deployments. OPA can let you enforce a policy like that that's really custom to your organization, something that the community wouldn't have already built out. OPA is great for those types of custom policies. A bunch more in here. Nova checks for out-of-date Helm charts. Pluto detects deprecated API versions. We've got Prometheus gathering CPU and memory metrics. There's an admission controller, which can, rather than just detecting things that are wrong in your cluster, it can actually block things as they're coming in. Right sizer helps with out of memory exceptions, all sorts of fun stuff in here. Once those are all installed, you'll start getting action items back. These are, again, things like security and reliability issues that you might see. So I can filter, say, for Polaris issues and see, what Polaris has found within my cluster here. You can see I've got some containers with privilege escalation allowed, some containers that are running as a root. So these are all kind of high-level security issues that I should really go in and fix in this demo environment here. But I want to really dig into the cost and efficiency functionality, given that this is a cost-focused webinar here. Like I said before, this is a demo environment, so it's going to look pretty small and consistent across all these clusters. But you can kind of get a sense for what we're showing here. We can see for each of these clusters, it has a capacity of 4 CPUs that are available across all nodes. We can see, we're requesting most of that CPU. But for each of these clusters, our utilization is pretty small, right? We're only using 0.22 CPUs out of all 4 CPUs that we have available. So this tells me that there's some room here for improvement where I might be able to save a good deal of money, maybe cut down on, 75% of my bill by getting my capacity more in line with my actual usage. I can also see a breakdown here by cluster of how much each of these clusters is costing me. I can also dig into individual workloads here. So here I'm looking at a Prometheus server instance running inside of one of these workloads. And you can see my actual usage is well below where I've set my requests and limits. So I've requested, about a gig of memory here, but I'm only using, maybe half a gig of memory at any given time. And so Insights is recommending that I set my requests and limits a good deal lower here. You can see this green line is where it's recommending I set it to. And this could help me save some money just by requesting fewer gigs of memory. I can see the same thing for CPU as well. Again, I've set my limits at my requests at a quarter CPU and my limits at half a CPU, and I'm never really getting close to where that is. I'm really only using at most 0.15 CPUs. So Insights is recommending that I set this, well lower than what it is today. I can also see, across all these workloads, what my average total cost for that workload is. So I can see that Prometheus server instance is costing me about $10 a month. And I can see with my recommendations, it would cost me, about a dollar less per month. Insights will also detect under-provisioned things like this Jenkins workload. Insights is saying, hey, you've under-provisioned this. You might be experiencing some slowness, some out-of-memory exceptions, things like that. It's actually recommending that I spend more money and increase my memory and CPU settings. And again, I can see, up here, I can see exactly what the breakdown is per workload. What each individual workload's cost me, what's my most expensive workload, et cetera. Hopefully that gives you all a sense for, how Insights can help you, save money, understand where that savings lies, things like that. We also do some awesome stuff around scanning infrastructure as code if you want to catch things earlier on in the process. So that helps for, like these, privilege escalation issues. You might want to catch those at pull request time and see, exactly, what you would need to change in your infrastructure as code to prevent that from happening. That really kind of speeds up the development loop here. So we can scan, you can basically install Insights inside of an individual repository as part of your CI/CD pipeline, and we'll scan all your infrastructure as code and potentially block a pull request if there are any issues there. Hopefully that's a good overview of Insights. I'm happy to take any questions on Fairwinds Insights as well.
That was great, Robert. Thank you so much. I know we've had some successes with some of our clients with these different recommendations, finding ways to save them a lot of money. And that's been really exciting. Awesome. Well, if there aren't any more questions from the audience, I think we might have one more polling question, Cody, if you don't mind putting that up. Awesome. So what is your greatest opportunity? Oh, where'd it go? There we go. What is your greatest opportunity to improve your Kubernetes environment? Is it getting help with the basics? Would you be interested in general best practices assessments? Would you like to improve the security posture of your clusters? Are you looking to save money? Or is improving the reliability of your apps running in Kubernetes the most important to you? And Liz and Robert, while we wait for these results, would you mind sharing, of our clients, which one of these would you say is most important to those people that you've noticed?
Wow. Well, I can't think of anyone who doesn't want to save money,
Very
but I
true.
do think that it spans. I would say, cost savings and security seem to be probably the most common that I've seen, and ways to enable service ownership within those two genres. I think a lot of organizations really struggle to ensure that their teams feel empowered to action on items. And those are probably the two umbrellas that they want them to action in on the most.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
I think in general, bigger organizations do start to care a lot about security, and they also have more opportunities to save money. I think if you're a small startup, a lot of times your cloud bill is such a small part of your costs that you don't really mind if you're running a few extra instances of your one little application. But for a big enterprise that's running 20 different applications, you can start to save real money if you get in there and fine tune each of those apps.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Looks like the results are in, and a lot of people are really concerned with improving security and reliability, which makes a lot of sense. And Kubernetes is great for that, for sure. Awesome. Well, Robert and Liz, thank you both so much for coming and chatting with us today. And I believe we do have a white paper that is available if anyone's interested. And yeah, we really appreciate your time. And Cody, we appreciate you having us.
Well, thank you for being here. I would like to thank Liz, Grace, and Robert for taking the time out of their busy schedules to join us today. And to our audience, just a reminder that this session was recorded. So following this program, you'll receive an email with a link to access that recording on demand, or you can find it living on the Container Journal website at containerjournal.com/webinars, and just be sure to look in the on-demand section. So I do still have those 4 $25 Amazon gift cards to give out. Our 4 winners are Kumar M, Vanya G, Jan C, and Sandra S. So to our 4 winners, congratulations. Keep an eye on your email inbox to claim that gift card, but if you don't happen to see that email, do check your spam folder. I would like to thank Fairwinds for sponsoring today's program, and to our audience, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you spending time with us, and we just want to ask for one extra moment of your time to fill out a survey that will pop up on your screen as soon as we close out. Otherwise, we do hope to see everyone at an upcoming Techstrong Learning program. Liz, Robert, Grace, thank you all so much. Everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Cody.